Well, good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who were here last year, you'll remember this routine. This is going to be a very robust discussion, obviously. This is also going to be, and I warn you in advance, I have to do a little bit of television magic because this is going to be shown nationally. We're trying to get a wider audience into this discussion to hear what you have to say. So I'm going to have to do a few little television things before we begin, and as we go on, I can't imagine many of you have been to a conference where the moderator has thrown to a commercial halfway through. That's going to happen. But once we're over all that part of it, it will be a very normal conversation, and I want to get as many of you involved. We have an extraordinary panel, but I want to get as many of you involved as I can. And because we have a limited time for this, my only request to you is that within about the first 20 seconds of you standing up, if I could hear the formation of what will be a question, that would be a very good thing. Because as we all know, the worst thing that can happen at a conference is when somebody says, well, now, I've got 18 points I'd like to make. Anyway, we won't do that. So with your indulgence, what's going to happen here is that I'm going to give a short introduction to the show. It is called The West Block. I will do that. I will then introduce you to the panelists here, and we're going to get going. No opening statements. We're going to get right into the heart of the matter. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. We're going to get going in about 30 seconds.
Is that a commercial?
Yeah, that's not a commercial yet, Admiral, but yeah. Although if I could sell that time, I would.
Great job. You're Skylar and John. How does it feel? Thank you.
I'll still look after you.
Okay, here we go. Welcome to this special edition of the West Block from the Halifax International Security Forum. And what a time for this conference. The first time since the events in Paris a little more than a week ago that the world experts have come together to try and untangle what has happened and what is going on. As I said, this comes shortly after Paris. It also comes after the bombings in Beirut. It comes after the bombings in the skies over the Sinai, and this weekend, the slaughter in Mali. All expressions, deadly expressions of Islamic jihadism. So in this room, some of the brightest minds in the world in the area of governance, military, security, even journalism and academia are all on display here. And what's going to be discussed here this weekend is incredibly important because it will help shape the world response to what is now a clear and present danger for us all. We have an extraordinary panel to start, and I'd like to introduce them. First of all, General John Allen, who is now with the Brookings Institute, but was very recently, as you all know, the presidential envoy to the coalition to confront the Islamic State. Admiral Bill Gortney wears two hats at this event, not only as the commander of NORAD, but also as the commander of the U.S. Northern Command. Harjit Sajjan, Canada's new Minister of National Defense, and I might just point out as well, a three-time veteran of Afghanistan and the gang wars in Vancouver. General John Vance, Canadian Chief of the Defense Staff, used to be the boss of this guy over here, also a veteran of Afghanistan, and Janice Stein, who is the Bellsberg Professor of Conflict Management and the founding director of the Munk School for Global Affairs. Welcome to you all, and let me kick off this discussion right away. General Allen, is this the new normal when you take a look at Paris, Beirut, and now Mali? Is this the new normal?
Well, that's a very important question. Let me just take advantage of the microphone for a moment and tell you, I was in Paris in January on coalition business when the first attack occurred. And I watched with horror as it unfolded a week ago today. And I just have to say that the French remain an indomitable people and the very personification of grace and adversity, courage under fire, and resilience under the worst conditions, and they set the standard for all of us in these kinds of emergencies. And my prayers go out to them every moment. We hope this isn't the new normal. But we have to be thinking expansively, and I'll try to make 3 quick points. We have to be thinking sufficiently expansively about what is going through the minds of the leadership of this organization, Daesh, the Islamic State. I'll refer to it as Daesh. We talked about a long time ago that there could be a time when this organization, when it feels enough pressure at the core, could begin something that would look like a concerted counterattack. And we need to be thinking in those terms. We need to be thinking offensively. Is this a response to the squeeze that is occurring of the core surface area of Daesh in Syria and in Iraq? And it has been squeezed, it has been diminished, the leadership is under attack constantly, and has this now resulted in something that looks like a counterattack? And we need to be thinking in those terms, expansively enough. That's the first thing. The second thing is, are we thinking properly about the organization? And I would contend that it probably has 3 components, and we need to be thinking in those terms. The first is the core surface area in the region of the Middle East, Syria and Iraq. The second would be the enclaves that have now been designated as provinces of the Caliphate, and there are a number of them. And then the third very important aspect of this is the network that binds the two. The one is the base, which gives purpose. The outlying elements of the organization give it the capacity to reach globally. But what operationalizes the connectivity between the core and the outlying provinces is the network, which provides for command and control and the flow of resources, the movement of fighters potentially, and a sharing of the narrative. That it's the narrative and the idea which is important. So are we thinking expansively enough about it? And we must, in my mind. And then the third thing is, Daesh is a symptom of something that we have to solve. We have got to get to the left of the radicalization. We have got to get to the left of what creates the causes in the lives of human beings that causes them to be radicalized and ultimately become part of such an abhorrent organization. First, we have to solve the problem in Syria, the political problem in Syria. Until we do that, we're going to be dealing with Daesh and son of Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra and others. But second, more broadly, we must embrace the countering of violent extremism and get far to the left. While we have to fight Daesh, get far to the left of the organization in radicalization.
Let me pick up on that point, because Janice, I wonder if you could give us some sense, before we get into how do we get to victory, which is what General Allen was talking about. Tell me what victory looks like.
Well, I agree with General Allen.
Thank God.
Victory looks like a political solution in the Sunni Arab heartland, which is where Daesh is concentrated. Where some of you may not agree with me is that it's not clear that we can reconstitute the states in that Sunni heartland in exactly the same way they were before this 100-year-old order began this period of implosion and collapse. But we have to have a political solution for what today constitutes Iraq and Syria, and more broadly speaking, a solution which speaks to the Sunni aspirations in this part of the world. I think the second very important point is to understand, as General Allen said, exactly what Daesh is. And it's difficult. If it were easy, we would have solved this. It's a parastatal organization because it claims to be a caliphate. It's a franchise organization. And those from the private sector will understand what I'm talking about. And the communication between the central core and the franchise is not always clear to us. It's a network, and it speaks to those young people in our societies that are alienated, angry, and are the subject of recruitment. The final piece I just want to put on the table is it operates in virtual space as well as physical space. Much of the recruitment that is so troubling to all of us occurs with very sophisticated digital tools. If you look at the investments that Daesh has made in social media, in videography, it would compete, frankly, with the best of us. And we haven't really fully grasped that, nor thought of the strategy that we need to deal with that.
I want to move this both onto the political stage and to the military stage, because both eventually have to cooperate with one another. General Vance, let me start on the military side of things. When we've seen what's happened in Paris and now in Mali, is this the time to keep on doing more of the same, or is it time to pivot and to do something different?
Well, let's go back to your first question to General Allen. Is this a new normal? There is new elements to it, but there's also an element of normalcy to this violence in the world that we don't like, that we'd like to get ahead of. So you could also pose the question, are our responses new normal or old normal? You have to look at both sides of the equation. And clearly, I would agree with both my colleagues that something needs to change. I think what has become readily apparent to all of us for a long time, especially those in uniform, that deep in our DNA is an expectation of the decisiveness of the use of military force. We have been accustomed to calling in the cavalry, as it were, using the military and having a better solution as a result of that. And I think what we've learned over the challenges since the end of the Cold War, and perhaps if we look back into history, have some good examples from history, where military force is only as decisive as it can be, absent a framework that respects the fact that military force is a condition setter. It supports other things to have occurred or to occur. And so to get left of the problem, you may want to use military force in conflict prevention. You may need to stop conflict temporarily because use of military force has a temporal aspect to it. And you can make that temporary last a long time if you just keep going at it. But nonetheless, the persistent, permanent changes that we seek have to do with a more comprehensive approach. NATO would call it comprehensive approach. We call it 3D, whole of government, whatever you want. There needs to be an absolute understanding of where the military fits in and why. And I'd end, Tom, by saying that the application of military force doesn't work very well unless there's a strategic framework within which those military objectives accrue to achieve something. Now, I respect the fact, and I think we all should, that sometimes the objectives are to manage things until you can figure something better out. We have to respect that. Military force is good at perhaps creating that pause. We're also learning to work by, with, and through partners to achieve effects. So there's a bit of an indirect approach, and nonetheless that takes a lot of strategic patience. And so if you think about the timelines of where rapid use of military force can be successful and the longer haul of where institution building occurs, it sort of gives you a sense of how you would apply it. Now just say that a training mission is an extremely valuable thing, but you don't just want to be producing cannon fodder for the next tactical fight. You want to win that tactical fight, so you got to do it, but you're also participating in institution building of a security or defense institution of a country, and the country needs to be able to use it correctly, build it, nurture it, and ultimately secure its borders.
Minister Sajjan, you haven't been in your portfolio very long, but you've got a to-do list which is pretty extensive at this point. On the political side, everybody in this room and across the country knows that it is the policy of your government to withdraw from the bombing campaign element of the coalition and to increase the amount of training for, in our case, Kurdish Peshmerga troops. A lot of people have asked this in light of Paris. Why can't we do both? What's the advantage in pulling out of the bombing mission?
Well, one of the things we need to take a look at is, I think as the both generals mentioned, we need a good understanding of the problem itself. And we don't go into any type of conflict alone. We're part of a bigger coalition. When you have a better understanding, I think this is where Canada's contribution in terms of a training role can have a more meaningful, much more meaningful impact. We also, because we have to take a look at how did we even get here to ISIS? It was them taking ground. So unless we train the Iraqi forces, the Peshmerga, to be able to take the fight to ISIS with additional support, we're not going to be able to set the conditions for what General Vance had just mentioned, the other institutional building, looking at slowing down the recruitment, because fighting will buy you time, which will allow you to look at the full set. And then if you don't figure that out, you're not going to be able to stop the recruitments. If you do not slow down the recruitment, you'll be continue fighting.
Let me ask you though, just before I go to Admiral Gortney, On that point, the idea in Canada's case, we are training Kurdish Peshmerga troops. They fight not under the Iraqi flag, they fight under their own flag. When the shooting is all over, they don't want to be part of Iraq. Can we count on them to take the fight to Daesh? Can we count on them if there's an offensive that is going on in Baghdad, for example? Will they leave their compound? These are interesting questions. Who exactly are we supporting?
Well, this is a complexity I think we have to be very mindful of. And I've stated this before, any contribution that we make or decisions we make, we need to fully understand the dynamics. This is not just strictly about we have to fight ISIS, but we also got to look at all the different regional dynamics and the relationships between the Kurds, the Sunnis, the Shias, and the entire region. So when we do add the contribution for something, we got to make sure that it has the right impact on the ground, and we don't end up creating another problem set for us as well.
Admiral Gordon, I want to get to you because you wear two very interesting hats in this operation. And I refer to it as the home game and the away game. And the home game has to, I would imagine, reflect the away game. The strategies have to be integrated. And when you're charged not only with NORTHCOM, but when you're charged with NORAD, the defense of the North American homeland, if you want to put it that way, you've got a whole new set of problems. We've talked here about the idea of homegrown radicalization, the fact that in the Paris attacks, the mastermind, in fact, was a Belgian, lived in Belgium, didn't come in the refugee stream. What are the particular challenges that we face in terms of North America? Is there going to be a greater pressure, for example, to implement continental security, perimeter security for North America?
Well, I see under my NORAD hat, which is the aerospace defense, my mission not changing. We execute that under Operation Noble Eagle, and we have been monitoring the threat reports and the threat streams of AQ, Al-Qaeda, AQAP, and we're assuming that Daesh would also go to the air to spread their message of terror. And so that mission will continue to be there, and we'll work with our mission partners in order to defend the skies and the territory of both Canada and the United States. The other piece is an additional element to what John talked about, though, under my NORTHCOM mission set, is the very sophisticated social media campaign that Daesh is creating that is encouraging citizens to do harm to their fellow citizens, be it here in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in Paris, in Germany, in the UK, wherever. And that's going to be a long-term problem that we have to work with as we go to getting left of the radicalization that John talked about. You know, if the ones that I'm most concerned about in that particular regard are those that are not communicating back, those that are in the receive mode of this very sophisticated social media campaign and choose to do something and they're not communicating back. If they're communicating back, we may have the tools that might pick them up, and we would, our law enforcement partners who are in charge of this in the United States would be able to do something about it. And so it's because of this homegrown violent extremists motivated by this social media campaign, choose to do something, radicalized internally, and then goes out to choose to do something. This is what we assessed to occurred in Chattanooga, that very nature, which is why we raised months before that force protection condition for the DoD facilities. And I'm most concerned against the soft targets that are out there. You know, I would, if I'm going to be attacked, I'd rather be attacked where I have a good defense, where I have a hard base. And I think they're smarter than that, and they are going after these soft targets, as we saw at Tahor and Paris. And that's where we all have to come together to go after the left of that John mentioned, and then work with our law enforcement partners to the authorities that we have to make sure that we are able to prevent it and then respond appropriately.
I want to throw this out to all of you, and feel free to join the discussion whenever you want. But we're talking about, you were talking about soft targets, made me think of hard targets. We've been bombing in Iraq and Syria for almost a year now. How can there be any targets left? You would think that we'd hit them all by now, and yet we continue to find new targets to hit. Has it been that our rules of engagement have not matched the task at hand? In other words, I submit that I think it's 2/3 of the missions come back without having dropped any ordnance, because the rules of engagement for American forces, and I imagine, General, is the same for Canadian forces, that we can't drop bombs if we think we're going to kill civilians.
Yeah.
Now, the Russians have I'm not sure it's even a rule of engagement. They just bomb, and they don't care about it. Are we going to have to change the nature of the military campaign? Do we have to become a little bit more bloody about it? Do we have to care a little bit less about the rules of engagement?
I hope we would never relax our the restrictions that we put on our aircrew and open up the collateral damage. We're very, very serious about that. We're only there to do damage to those that we want to do damage to. And we take great concern. When you're down there looking at your forward-looking infrared display and you hold the decision between whoever's underneath that crosswell of life or death, we take that very seriously, and I would hope we would never restrict that.
You know, just
that. From the military side, you have to also understand that the bombing for a year, 7,000 plus bombs, those are tiny points of light, on a great big map. And the campaign is intended right now to set conditions for the ultimate degradation and defeat. It's being used for what exactly was stated, its intention, which is to prevent the spread, hold that geography, put the pressure on until other things can happen. Most importantly, the arrival to the battlefield of trained, effective, local indigenous forces that can actually do the detailed clearing and reestablishment of their borders. So, I'm with Admiral Gortney here. You can't carpet bomb your way to victory either. So what we've set up here and what General Austin and CENTCOM is running and what the coalition is contributing to is a carefully managed operation that's not trying to and is not selling the fact that we're going to defeat it with air power. Yet, so a fighter that comes back with bombs still attached because the collateral is too high, that's a good thing. Fighter that does strike, that's a good thing. Because we know that's probably going to be, important and contribute to degradation. But as I said in my earlier comments, if you think the military just sets conditions and needs a wider approach, you can't do it just with one arm of the military either. And so the air power is doing what it's supposed to do right now. But of course, that won't last. There has to be other things.
And the target,
the
target sets that you go after, you want to make sure that you're not destroying the infrastructure that's going to be required in the next phase. So it's a fine line that you're trying to seek to get there. What is it what is the type of target that you're going after? And what is the second and third order effect?
I don't want to put words in our new minister's mouth, but
you will.
But I will. I wouldn't be surprised if he were to add that actually so-called collateral damage or killing innocent civilians in Afghanistan was one of the most destabilizing unintended consequences of our strategy at different times. We've learned from that, and so I couldn't agree more, Tom, that it would be a strategic mistake to change those rules.
If I could just add to that also is, you also based on my previous experience is, you want to fight on your terms. Right? And when you fight on your terms, you take the hurt to them at the appropriate time, that's going to have the impact. Because you always have to be mindful what the second and third order effects are. And we learn very quickly that we need to do this. Otherwise, what you're going to be doing is actually creating more fighters, and that's not what you want to do. You don't want to leave a village that has been destroyed homes, and when the people get there and they blame you, they're not going to be blaming anybody else. So you've got to be very mindful of that.
Okay. With that, we're going to take a short break, and the West Block from the Halifax International Security Forum will be back right after this.
Sorry.
General Allen, let me pick up the conversation with you, because we've talked about the forces getting to a certain point, setting the conditions for victory as opposed to absolute victory. And of course, the question that has haunted this mission from the very beginning has been the question of soldiers on the ground, that this cannot be won from the air. When we see the Islamic State now stretching beyond the borders of the so-called caliphate and into the heart of Europe itself, and who knows where after that, are we getting closer to the point where we've got to re-examine that question of boots on the ground?
Well, let me go back to my initial comments, which was, are we considering the entirety of Daesh in its proper context? Are we seeing it in its strategic whole? And I would contend that we are just beginning to. And we really do need to see the outer edges of it so that we can bring to bear the right kinds of measures of national power, not just necessarily military power, but measures of national power in order to accomplish our objectives. So let me start from the outside and sort of work my way in. I would contend that we have dealt a great deal with an integrated military campaign that delivers military power and other things, but military power against targets in the core of Daesh. If in fact Daesh has metastasized into a strategic global entity, then we need to be thinking differently about the kinds of measures of power that we bring to bear against it. For example, we'll probably still find that either bilateral, multilateral, or regional counterterrorism approaches can be effectively wielded against organizations like Boko Haram or Ansar Bet al-Maqdis, those kinds of organizations. But going back to my point about dealing with the provinces, dealing with the core, it is the network which operationalizes the outer edges with the center. So we need to be thinking about, are we properly organized for this campaign? Are we bringing in effectively, in a concerted, comprehensive, and integrated ways, the ministries of interior now of our partners within the coalition and their law enforcement entities, and properly structuring that relationship with intelligence so that our law enforcement entities and ministries of interior are bearing down hard on that network, finding out the key nodes and critical pathways to begin the process of corrupting that network so that the Belgian operational leader of the Paris attack just simply can't move back and forth from Syria. We're constantly going after the networks that are facilitating the flow of fighters. So we've got to be organized properly. An important part of this is what we discovered in Iraq in 07, 08, 09, we discovered it again in Afghanistan, is many of these terrorist organizations are laminated on top of criminal networks. And there's a substantial element of criminality to the movement of foreign fighters. Criminal networks move people, they move guns, and they move money. And they do that very well. And they have done it often for centuries. And so when we combine the efforts of our law enforcement entities with intelligence and our ministries of interior in the larger strategic campaign, then we can begin to take this network apart and separate the provinces from the core and deal with the provinces in regional and bilateral, multilateral counterterrorism matters.
I just want to bring up something, and again for all of you, and then I am going to move into the crowd in a minute. You know, the history, we're talking about how you get there, and you've just, General, examined one of the sort of tactical ways that we can do that. But let me ask you this, because the history of training forces in that part of the world, surrogate forces if you want, has not been all that terrific. We spent, what was it, $500 million training, the Americans did anyway, training surrogates from rebel armies in Syria. 60 of them actually graduated and surrendered on the first day. And then the program was...
I'm going to take issue with that question. You finish it, though.
Okay, well, fair enough. But the program was ended after that in terms of training. But outside of the issue that I brought up with you, Minister, in terms of who we're training and therefore the complexities on the ground of dealing with so many diverse groups, is the Iraqi army up to the task after Mosul in 2014? Is there anything in Syria that can work for us on the ground to supplement the conditions that we're laying out with our campaign right now, Janice?
So to come back to General Allen's point, just for 1 minute to answer your question, what we're actually seeing is action in the provinces. Another way of thinking about what happened in France is Europeans were attacking Europeans with actually very minimal logistical and financial support, unfortunately, which makes it tougher, right? The Russian plane that was in the Egyptian theater, it was done very likely by networks operating in the Sinai. So these are very localized actions that can wreak a considerable amount of damage with localized resources and actually, and this makes it harder, stunningly little support from the network. Yes, there's back and forth, but what moved? Not a lot of money, very small number of people, and the weapons are purchased in local markets.
Criminal markets.
Criminal, that's right, and they're enabled by criminal gangs. I couldn't agree more. So what we need, and that's where I agree with General Allen, we need to think about this as what will work in the local markets. What does France have to do to make its Muslim population feel genuinely welcome and accepted? There is a long-standing problem with the Bedouin in the Sinai Peninsula that we've known about for years that have been franchised into this. Nigeria has its own problem. So if we look then at the heartland, which I think is the key, which is Iraq, Syria, there are very different conditions in those two countries. The Iraqi army right now, Shia officered, attempting to operate effectively in the Sunni part of Iraq. That's difficult, and that's why this is so hard. Syria is fragmented. The army that is Alawite officered is cracking under the strain right now. So again, I think we have to think more creatively, out of the box. Not only, we have to think about it in provincial terms, and we have to think about it in digital space, because the recruiting effort that is going on, and we've not succeeded in slowing recruitment, and that should be our primary objective, that's digital.
General Allen, I'd be remiss if I didn't give you an opportunity to rebut something I just said.
Well, I think we need to be accurate here. Much of the money that was spent out of that $500 million, and we didn't come close to the end of it, was spent on equipment. And you are right. It didn't produce the numbers that we wanted, but something very important did happen in northern Syria, and it's called the Kurds and the Turkmen and the Syrian Sunni Arab elements that came together and in a concerted operation enabled by the international coalition moved Daesh off the Syrian-Turkish border all the way from Iraq to the Euphrates. And we're currently working with the Turks to build the capacity to close the remaining portion of that border, about 98 clicks. The rest of the border is no longer in the hands of Daesh. And that was an enabled and supported indigenous force that moved Daesh off the border with a lot of casualties. I'm not going to get into body count numbers. I'm going to tell you it was a lot of casualties. And we're now pushing on Raqqa. We've just taken Al-Hal in the east. Our Kurdish allies, I can't overstate the work that they have done, the valor of their troops, and how we all mourn their martyrs. But they have done magnificently here, and they've just taken back Sinjar. They have just cut Route 47, which connects Mosul with Raqqa. And these are not individual fights. These are pieces of a larger strategy to pressure Daesh, to crush, and ultimately to begin to shrink it. And as we do that, we have to operate against the rest of this strategic compound that I talked about in the past.
So Tom, I think what we're doing is we're telling you that there's no one silver bullet. And training is a part of a continuum, and a valuable part. The failure of a unit or even a long-term effort in training is probably less a function of a failure in training and equipping, but a failure of the state organs and institutions to be able to sustain and be able to employ that force effectively, such that that force is loyal to the cause, is getting paid, has got all the things that a force needs to have to be able to be effective in their own land. So, no matter, I'd say that the training was extremely effective. Great individually trained people. That they fight or not is not necessarily a function of training. It's a function of where they're coming from, what are they fighting for, do they see any value in the fight on that day. And so it is an effort that has to go beyond the training, but you can't do it without the training. The training has to start, and you've got to create the base and a force that can be used. And you can't start them at the same time. Some things take a lot longer. Creating a government that can use its armed forces and creating that national state is going to take longer than creating an infantryman. But you got to have the infantrymen ready when they're ready to be used.
Minister, go ahead.
I just want to add to what General Vance and General Allen was saying. we kind of look at the success or the lack of success based on what we see trading. And again, I think Janice was talking about, and we want to stress that things are connected. The social fabric of the society, sometimes, as General Vance mentioned, it may not be in the training issue. The training might have been gone extremely well, but there's some other, I want to give it back, just bring it back to Afghanistan a bit, tribal dynamics. There are other dynamics that are happening in Iraq, which I'm not fully up to speed on. But the level of complexity that we were able to understand in Afghanistan over the years, that's what made our understanding, and we were able to have our successes at those times. So as we move forward, we need to get a deeper understanding, and not just from our lens. We need to be able to talk to the experts, and this room is going to be a great forum for this, where we can actually, somebody here might have the answer for some of those complexities. So when we start looking at the assessment of success or the lack of success, we need to make sure we get a good understanding of all the different nodes. Daesh, when it comes to the criminal networks, there's so many nexuses we can go after, and we need to get that full understanding. So one, when we do make that strike, it's going to create the impact that we want, and not create a negative impact as well.
Here's a political question for you, Minister. How important is Russia?
I think it's important for us to understand, just in the vein of the conversation that I just mentioned here, is that we need to make sure that we have a good understanding of the dynamics at play with Russia. We obviously know that the dynamics that are at play in Syria right now is further complicating the situation. We need to make sure we understand the dynamics within how Russia plays and how it interacts with the other countries. We have to be constantly monitoring everything on a regular basis, and we have to. And then, what I would like to see, instead of from a reactive sense, that our understanding gets to the point where we can actually look at a predictive, get into a predictive sense, be able to predict future threats, and I'm not just talking about future threats in terms of in our own nation. I'm talking about the actual threats within Syria, within Iraq as well.
Okay. On that note, we are once again going to take a short break, and we will be back with more of the West Block from the Halifax International Security Forum right after this. And just before we come back, if anybody wants, just raise your hand, and I will get to you as quickly as I can. Okay, there's a few hands up. All right.
Talk about the Kurds.
We ready to come back?
That's going to fragment.
Okay.
No.
Welcome back to the special edition of the West Block from the Halifax International Security Forum. We are talking about the aftermath of the massacre in Paris, and I'm going to go up into the audience now. Yes, sir, you have your hand up.
Thank you. Giga Bokeria, Georgia. Two short questions. First, all the speakers agreed that there seems to be a problem that besides Kurdish fighters, there's no force within the Sunni area to fight against ISIS. What happened to Sunni awakening councils? We remember that they were presented, or they were really an effective tool against Taliban. Is it true? Is there any perspective? And second question to all the speakers, which one of you believes that Putin's Russia really has an interest in resolving the Syria problem? Thank you.
I'll take
Bad guys.
I was
Take the second, too.
I was eye deep in the Sunni awakening, the Sahawa al-Iraq. So I will simply tell you that it was enormously effective, frankly, ultimately in converting the tribes, bringing the tribes over, and each one of the tribes ultimately created within their tribal areas a no-go for al-Qaeda. And ultimately al-Qaeda was shrunk and was defeated in Al-Anbar and then more broadly across Iraq. What made that happen, though, was that we were fighting right alongside them. And we gave them the support they needed. We gave them the economic resources to recover their communities. And it's a different model today. It doesn't fit. But we are working with the sheikhs. We are working with the tribes. They are bringing their sons forward. We're training tribesmen at Al-Taqaddam every single day in the Al-Anbar province. And we are. With regard to the political question, I don't remember it actually.
That's the good answer. Yeah.
Maybe I can take the
The political question was about Putin, and does anybody really believe that Putin has, and I don't mean to paraphrase you, but
So why don't I take that one on as
You can take that.
non-official? Yeah, occasionally I indulge in alternative futures, and I think about a Russia that is heavily invested in defending a Shia community and an Alawite community in Syria, and alienates the whole of the Sunni Arab world.
That's right.
If you think forward, that is not a brilliant strategy.
Okay. We have another question right here. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Alexis Wachowski. I'm with the Harmony Institute. We're a think tank that studies how media influences people. And I wanted to ask a question about the media recruitment when we're talking about Daesh. In the same way that we've not been able to yet stop recruiting through the social media networks because governments have to follow certain rules and regulations about how we operate. There are groups who are ironically kind of aligned with us at this point, like Anonymous, who have declared war also on ISIS and have effectively taken down thousands of accounts over the last few days. So I wanted to ask some of the members of the panel what they thought about the government's ability to work with, if there was a possibility to work with some of these groups to get at this digital recruiting and find a way to sort of stop it.
Who would like to take that on?
I think it's a very important proposal, actually, and I can't tell you specifically on this particular day how much the U.S. government has reached out, but within the context of the coalition, the British and the Emiratis are leading the process, and other members of the coalition are participating, and part of that process is dealing with the tech industry and working to understand how we can use industry standards for content both as a tool for us and as a weapon against them. So your question is really important. As Janice said, we're really waging war against Daesh in spheres, the physical sphere where we're dealing with it on the ground, in the financial sphere as we seek to shrink its resources, but maybe the most important sphere and where the decisive outcome will be determined is in the information sphere. And part of that is having a superior message, part of that is having a deterrent message, part of that is ensuring that our Arab friends with a Muslim voice are prominent in that message. And so it has to be a very inclusive approach. And industry and the private sector has to be a very important partner for us. And I think we came to that conclusion probably a little later than we should have, but I believe that we're fully embracing it now. So thank you for that.
And I'd just like to say as well just that this is very complex in that as you think it through, who do you think would be in charge of that response? What part of a government would you have being that cyber actor that decides? How would you do it at a coalition level? How would you get to a standard of conduct? So it's all good, I agree. It's all part of what would ultimately be a part of spheres where you want to have influence. But as we work through the details, I'd ask you back to think about how would you actually manage that? How would you command it? How would you control it? How would you limit it? And how would you get that across to your populations as something good to do?
So this is not going to be music to General Vance's ears, but maybe a command and control model is just not right. Maybe we're talking about a very diverse ecology involving the private sector, involving some of our creative young people and letting go of the control, because the more diverse the message is. For instance, one interesting way to think about it is how are we reaching out to young Arabs who are creative, edgy, willing, looking for opportunities and voice, but don't necessarily have the tools that they need. Maybe our role is to enable the messaging and enable the creativity and the diversity and the richness, and then back off from the control and run that risk. Because if we can populate the environment with diverse, authentic narratives, that to me is a big part of a successful strategy.
We have to figure
You're good
it
with
out.
that? Okay.
We did the mission analysis. We've done a mission analysis of it in the headquarters, and quite frankly, we feel that Daesh's center of gravity is their message, that they've established a caliphate. And so we have to counter that. That's where we should go. It's one of the elements. You go after where they have power, you go after where they have money, but we really need to go after their message. And to be honest, if we don't get after it, I don't really understand why we're not more successful. If you look at the horrors that how they execute their government, probably the wrong term of art, but how they go about it, that is attractive to somebody. Right. Someone would find that message attractive is just amazing to, I'm sure, this group that's here today. So we absolutely have to go about it, and I'm in full agreement, man. We're not, you can't have a clean C2 on this. We can't have a governance structure, but we need to figure it out. And I do want to give credit where credit's due to some of the big industries that are very responsive to our respect, to our asks as they take stuff off their particular social media account.
I just want to briefly bring in Canada's former Minister of National Defence, Peter MacKay. Peter.
Peter MacKay, recovering politician and local guy. To our distinguished panel, three of whom are Afghan vets and have extensive experience in that part of the world. NATO, one of our sponsors here, one of perhaps in my lifetime, the greatest collaborator in bringing together not only our military components to this fight against terrorism, but we've also seen NATO look outside its member states, the Jordanians, the Georgians,
That's right.
the member countries that took part in the mission in Afghanistan, which both our generals here are very familiar. What, if anything, do you have to say about the necessity of NATO considering Article 5? And in addition to what Janice was just referring to, bringing in a more concerted effort globally to greater collaboration with our security forces, non-military security forces, which we're seeing now in North America happening. That outreach through agencies like Canadian Security Establishment here in Canada, our security network across North America is becoming more and more integrated with our military because this is a non-traditional military conflict, to say the least. And so the twofold question, your thoughts on Article 5 as the rallying point to get all hands on deck, beyond just the NATO members, but also a greater effort to combat this homegrown terrorism and radicalization that we see happening everywhere.
Well, no one else jumped in, so I guess I'll have to. I think there's a couple of technicalities about the use of Article 5 in this case. I think it has to be asked for by the nation attacked. But I understand the spirit of the question. What will be the rallying cry? Whether it's the invocation of the Washington Treaty, the consultations associated with that, or something else. And I'd say, sir, you know, if it hasn't happened yet as a result of what's gone on in the world, I think all who are motivated are. I don't know what else. What more motivation needs to occur, or what levers need to be used to encourage nations to act. And even in Article 5 doesn't specify what you do. As you know, it's just you could just express displeasure, and that's how you would act. So. I think the rallying cry has occurred, and now we're in the detail of the management of the crisis, and it's going to. I think we need to understand it will take time, and I think that there needs to be a sustained effort. I think the Paris certainly reminded people that this is an active enemy that's trying to win, and at no point in campaign management will things just go on autopilot and at some point we'll be successful. This is going to take the energy of governments, the energy of civil society, the energy of militaries, the energy of the local population to deal with this.
And why limit it to NATO? It shouldn't be limited to just NATO.
Yeah.
This is a challenge. It's not an insurmountable challenge. It's going to be a long, hard, but we've got to, all elements of a lot of nations have to be involved. And to go after where the individual cells are that you've talked about in those different countries, it's a local tactical, it's the families, it's the mosques, it's the communities that have to get involved to break that path to radicalization.
And that radicalization is actually quite common, and I can speak from experience. It's still it's same as gang recruitment for organized crime. The organized crime, they actually either create a situation or they take advantage of a situation to lure somebody in. So we're talking about the message of Daesh and what they're trying to do. My humble suggestion onto this is let's make the message ineffective. How do we look at their message and people say, oh wow, we want to get part of it. How do we demonize that message?
That's right.
Right? That's the real key, is when the message who they're sending it to, the people that they're sending it to all of a sudden are horrified by it, are demonized by it. That's when we are going to be winning. That's the real, honestly, the real solution onto this. And absolutely, we need to start looking at the information technology and how we do that for social media. But I can also assure you, just like organized crime, when you have that much money involved, they will evolve, right? So we need to get down to the root of it, which is how do we make their message ineffective?
And maybe to Janice's point on that, their message is effective for young recruits going to Syria. So maybe what we ought to do is unleash the power of Silicon Valley to mirror actually what's going on. We have a comment from you, sir. Yes, go ahead.
I'm just back from Kiev, and I was there in the day of that horrible tragedy in Paris. And I talked to many common people, and they were saying exactly the words that Admiral has used. We are the collateral damage. Because they were saying Americans were not serious about fighting ISIS. When Putin got involved, now it became serious, then the airplane, then Paris, and now what? World will unite, it would be another anti-Hitler coalition, and everybody will forget about Ukraine and Eastern Europe. And that's what they fear, and Moscow news stations are telling exactly like that. Anti-Hitler coalition, we are different, but we are no longer enemies with America, we are now friends, and then it would be post-Yalta war, and new lines, and of course Ukraine would be Russia's.
When it comes, we also got to reverse it back a little bit further. ISIS wasn't to become this big organization overnight. And where was it when it was a smaller organization? So even go back further, what were the indicators at that time? And if we can start identifying what those indicators are, maybe we can start looking at how to target this at an early stage. But unfortunately, we also have to face the reality that's put in front of us, and that's now. And we have to figure out a way and get a really deep understanding of the situation from a political, social, and from the military side to come up with the solutions for that.
But to that point, though, and to pick up on what your question is, as Putin and Russia involve themselves in the Syrian campaign, and as we get seized with the whole campaign in Syria and Iraq, do we then move on to a post-Ukrainian situation with Russia, whereby those fights and battles go down the priority list?
So I would answer it the following way. This is a very, I understand precisely the direction of your question, and it's a reasonable fear for the community in Kiev to have. But strategy has phases, and there may well be, and it's, you know, and it has phases and it has multitasking in it. So it's entirely conceivable to have a phase concentration on Daesh, which is global rather than simply NATO. But that does not mean in any way that you take your eye off the ball in Ukraine, that you legitimate what's happened in Ukraine. And there is a morning after Daesh as well. And I'm one of those who doesn't think that that morning after is terribly far down the horizon. So the capacity to run a phase strategy and to multitask doesn't lead to the conclusion that you fear.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, and the fact that we're dealing with Daesh does not make our efforts mutually exclusive from still remaining committed to the Ukraine. What we have to do is deal with Daesh as an organization. We have to solve the political problem in Syria, which gave rise to the capacity of Daesh to have the capabilities that it has today, plus, by the way, a large number of other groups that have emerged that are radicalized Salafist organizations that we're going to have to deal with eventually as well. Daesh is an entity. It is a symptom of a bigger problem. We have got to solve the political problem in Syria. That has been complicated by the Russians. It hasn't been aided by the Russians, frankly. That doesn't mean at all that by dealing in Syria, we somehow diminish our support for the hugely moral support and the important material support for the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian cause. Those are inclusive, they're not mutually exclusive.
I just want to jump to another question here. Yes, ma'am. If you could identify yourself and your question.
Kaina Boagash, I'm a lawyer. First of all, I would like to invite every participant to stop, as the General Allen said, to stop using ISIS and using Daesh as the right definition to them, because ISIS being a goddess of life and magic, and definitely Daesh are not. My question is, post-Paris attack, for the first time, Manuel Valls referred to Salafism and the idea of cutting the aid to Salafism and start trying to find solution to cut the aid for recruitment. My question would be to the panelists whether part of this $500 million would use to education, to enable the youth, to enable women's right and human right in the region would help save maybe cutting the aid for recruitment, or at least slow it down. Thank you.
So humanitarian aid versus military aid. Who wants to take that on? Minister?
I think it's no. Everything is needed. It's not about one solution coming, one thing that's going to provide the solution. It's about looking at everything, as General Allen said. We have to look at it from holistically, and each thing has to be phased in at the right time to create the right impact. If we bring in, spend money on certain, say, education at the wrong time, when we're not even have a security umbrella in a certain area, how are we going to bring the teachers in? We can build a school, and we saw this many times, where you can build a school, the teachers are not there, it's a building, right? So absolutely, I agree with it, but we need to be able to phase it in at the right time, and this is where we need to, I think, step back, take a look at the problem set, and making sure that we collectively look at all the resources we bring to the table. We're not one nation bringing just our tools. We're collectively going to come up, figure out what the problem is. We have collectively provide certain assets to the table, and then what the military does best and with our civilian partners, come up with the right solution and phasing everything in to have the desired impact.
Without creating the conditions in time and space to allow the political process to unfold, you can't get out in front of it. We have to create those conditions in time and space, and with that, we have to bring in the political process, and with that then comes in all of the other elements that will allow this to go after the root causes in the region.
Makes me think, both you Afghan vets, of that Arghandab highway. We couldn't have built that Arghandab highway unless we controlled the ground first, because you can't put asphalt down under fire.
I even go further on that. It's not just about holding the ground. Well, it was actually about building a rapport with the population. And so it goes even beyond that, and that's what I really want to stress is you have to get a very deep understanding. And what used to frustrate me before was talking to people about a very difficult problem set without somebody who's not understanding. And when I would start diving down into the complexity of the problem, and when you actually get right down to it, it comes down to the individual families. And getting a good understanding of what their issues are. And when you understand that and you go start building a rapport with the population that's just trying to live their life, that's where the real solutions come out.
I want to go to a completely different subject, and I want to bring in Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia into this. And it has to do more with North America. You know, Canada, under the new government, is bringing in 25,000 Syrian refugees by New Year's Eve, apparently, Minister. You've just had a vote in your House of Representatives that basically almost blocks the idea of Syrian refugees coming in. What is it going to do to the unity of North America when we have 25,000 people who the Americans consider to be untrustworthy? And should there be a unified approach, even domestically here in the homeland, between Mexico, Canada, and the United States as to how we deal with this massive migration of humanity?
Well, I think a unified approach could be helpful, and we're going to have our own national differences about that approach, so complete unanimity is not possible, but consensus could be possible. But I would stay tuned to the way we work out this issue in the United States. The act that passed in the House yesterday, interestingly enough, the name of it, American Security Against Foreign Enemies Act. Syrian and Iraqi refugees, foreign enemies. You know, in the rush of concern, we have an enemy, and the enemy's ISIL. The enemies are not the refugees fleeing from ISIL. So in the immediate aftermath of a situation that naturally causes a lot of people to be afraid, and you got to respect that. You got to deal with the fears. Sometimes things will happen that then a little bit of calm will adjust. So I don't necessarily think that the bill that got through the House is going to get through the Senate just as is. But as we've built, you know, through NAFTA and post-NAFTA, we've gotten closer and closer and closer between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico on immigration and other matters. We're going to have to look at what we do. I mean, I think we were all grappling on issues about the visa waiver program and a whole series of things we're going to have to grapple with. It would be wrong for us to just do that in the abstract without coordinating what we do and communicating about it with our closest neighbors and our closest economic partners.
Thanks, Senator. Admiral, do you want to weigh in? Because this is really in your wheelhouse in terms of how North America responds to this massive migration.
Well, quite frankly, I think it's a political decision. So I'll go right back to my good senator from my home state. So, you know, from the defense of the homeland piece, we have the systems in place to vet people, to understand where they're coming from. Does that mean it's 100% foolproof? No, I don't know anything that's 100% perfect. And we'll put those processes in place, and we'll use the processes that we have.
Okay.
Maybe I can weigh in
Sure,
on
go
this
ahead.
one, Tom, as well. 25,000 is a small number of people from a security management perspective. So I'm not talking about the whole challenge, resettling and absorbing housing refugees, but just the security dimension. 25,000 is a small number when they have already been screened, pre-screened by the United Nations, and will be screened by our own security agencies. It is not difficult to coordinate with our friends south of the border to remove any concern that might exist. So I think securitizing that discussion, I'm going to take issue with the way you framed your question. Securitizing the conversation the way you did, that isn't supported by the evidence. I would only add one other comment, which is around perimeter security. If we want to understand the challenges of perimeter security, I think the place to have that discussion right now is in France, in Belgium, and in Germany, where they are grappling with perimeter security in real time.
Okay. And I'll just point out, too, that that question was based on the comments of some other colleagues of our good senators here, maybe on the other side of the floor from where Senator Kane sits. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of the time allotted for this. But I just, as a closing thought, if you could give me a brief closing thought on this point. What is the one thing that is going to stand in the way of victory against Daesh? General Allen.
An absence of coherence within the coalition and an absence of our having a universal understanding of what our objectives are. This is a time for the coalition to come together, to think expansively, and to dedicate ourselves to a final, ultimate objective, which is the defeat of Daesh.
Admiral, what's the one thing?
I would add to his, but defining the coalition. You know, bringing all of the nations that we all share the same values, that we do not agree with with Daesh in their way of life, in the way they. So I think identifying and pulling that coalition together is the first step.
What's, Minister, the one thing that can stop us winning this fight?
I agree with both the Admiral and General. What I'll also state is that we need to fully understand how this problem occurred. And I think we talked a little bit about that. Once we get a really good understanding of that, then you can start looking at how to reverse engineering for the solution as well.
General?
I think impatience. I think we need to see what can be successful in what time horizon. Do exactly as the General suggests, apply all the tools that you can that are appropriate for that time horizon, but recognize that it's going to take a long time. I mean, we fought a Cold War over decades. Here we've got something that's hitting us, you know, almost weekly. It's going to take a while, but we need to apply ourselves.
And as always, the final word goes to Janice Stein.
thinking about this only as a government problem and not broadening the coalition to include the private sector, to include civil society, to include the talented digital young people, and to understand, as the minister said, that the impetus for this comes from a deep failure in governance in the Sunni heartland and all the social and political consequences that flowed from that. That's what we've really got to talk about.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of this. I think by the number of hands that were still raised, we could have gone on for another couple of hours. It is going to be a discussion that is going to inform every discussion this weekend. And I submit to you that no discussion is more important than the one we're having now. Terrific panel. General Allen, Admiral Gortney, Minister Sajjan, General Vance, and Janice Stein, thank you all very much for being here. I appreciate it. And with that, I'll just say that is the West Block for this week, the special edition from the Halifax International Security Forum. Join us next Sunday from Paris at the International Climate Conference, an equally vexing problem for the world. See you next Sunday.